The Honda Civic has been around for a very, very long time, and it has always had a reputation for being well priced, very reliable, and very practical. And depending on how old you are and the generation of Civic you remember from your childhood, it's also been an excellent performance buy. Honda is hoping to recapture a lot of that with the all-new 2017 series of Civics. In addition to the well-known Civic sedan and of course the Honda Civic Coupe, which we've had in the US for a while, Honda is bringing back a 5-door Civic. But in a very interesting twist, the Civic Hatchback is not just the practical Civic. It also is the sporty Civic, because we get the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine standard in this model, and there's a trim where it gets a little bit more oomph. Honda's dedication to Civic performance goes beyond this 180 horsepower hatchback, however, because we will be seeing a Honda Civic Si coming back. It's taken a year off, and then after that we'll see the absolutely insane R, which will have an undisclosed amount of horsepower under the hood, probably somewhere around 300 or just below. The upcoming Civic Si and the R mean that this is the value performance Civic hatchback. This is not trying to be a Volkswagen GTI competitor. I actually think this is trying to be what the Volkswagen GTI started as. Over the generations, the Volkswagen GTI has become more powerful, it's become faster, it's become better handling, but it's become very expensive as well. And this particular model is 180 horsepower with wide 235 width tires, a 6-speed manual transmission, and a low $22,000 sticker price. Like the Civic sedan, the Civic Hatch receives Honda's latest front-end design theme, but instead of a chrome bar up front, we have this blacked out section to the front end. The headlamps are a combination halogen projector and halogen reflector design with fog lamps right down below. We also have this aggressive splitter on either side of the front bumper. Keep in mind we are driving the Sport trim. If you opt for the top-end Sport Touring trim, then we get the full LED headlamps that we see in the top-end trims of the Civic sedan. Although Honda will obviously sell quite a few Civic hatchbacks in the United States, this model was definitely designed for the European and other world markets. And as a result, it is about 4.4 inches shorter than a Honda Civic sedan at 177.9 inches long. Of course, the Civic has grown over time, and this is actually only about 2 inches shorter than a Volkswagen Golf station wagon, 10 inches longer than the Volkswagen Golf 4-door hatchback. The extra length versus the Volkswagen Golf is very noticeable right back here, because the rear end of the Civic has this definite taper towards the rear instead of that very boxy profile that we see in the Volkswagen. Obviously, that means for a vehicle this length, we have a slightly less practical cargo area, very obvious when you compare this to the Volkswagen Golf station wagon. But the extra length allows us to have a slightly more coupe-like profile overall and still have a very large cargo area. Aside from the overall compactness of the Civic hatchback, the other reason that we know this really is targeted at the European market and other world markets is because this Civic is actually built in the United Kingdom. It's not built in Japan or in the United States. The back end of the Civic Hatch is styled very much like the Civic sedan and the Civic Coupe. We have the same sort of lines going on, but we don't really have the same exact parts. Instead of a light pipe that connects one tail lamp module to the other, we actually have two different spoilers. One right here with the center-mounted brake light right there, and then a white one right there at the top of the glass. Because we're in the Sport trim, we have the center-mounted exhaust tips right down below. You'll see there's definitely a lot of styling going on for this rear look. From this angle, you can better see what's going on with the hatchback. We have one sheet of glass, and this spoiler actually goes over the glass. So this is not like a Toyota Prius, where they're two separate pieces of glass and then they meet sort of at a bend, and then we have this other spoiler right up top. Be sure and let me know what you think about the overall look of the Civic hatchback down there in the comments section. I think the Mazda 3 is very attractive in this segment, but this is certainly more aggressive and definitely more eye-catching. As I said before, unlike the other versions of the Civic, the hatchback has just one engine under the hood. It's a 1.5-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. If you get the LX, EX, or EXL trims of the Civic hatchback, then this engine will produce 174 horsepower and either 162 pound-feet of torque or 167, depending on whether you get the manual transmission or the continuously variable transmission. If you get the Sport trim that we're driving right here or the top-end Sport Touring trim, then power goes up to 180 horsepower and torque leaps to 177 if you choose the manual transmission. The main difference between the engine under the hood of the LX and the Sport trim that we're driving right here is the fact that this engine is tuned for premium unleaded gasoline, although it's not required for operation. A manual transmission is available in either the base LX trim or the Sport trim that we're driving right here. All of the other models will get a continuously variable transmission. The CVT is going to give you the best fuel economy in any version of the Civic hatchback. The model that we're driving right here comes in at 33 according to the EPA. You might have noticed that the fuel economy in the Civic hatch is a few miles per gallon below the Civic sedan, and the reason for that is right here in the wheel wells, because we have 235/40 R18 tires on this vehicle on 18-inch alloy wheels. You don't normally find 235 with low aspect ratio tires in a mainstream hatchback or mainstream sedan. And again, this is not necessarily a Volkswagen GTI competitor because this is considerably less expensive. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give this 9 out of 10 points in the top end trims, 8 out of 10 points in the model that we're driving right here. You won't find a power seat until those top end trims, so our model does have a manual driver's seat with a manual recline and no adjustable lumbar support. We do, however, have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, and headroom is very good in all models. Part of the size difference between the Civic hatch and the Civic sedan can be found back there in the trunk, because hatchbacks are a little bit more efficient in their overall use of space, but some of that difference actually happens in the back seat as well, because combined legroom in the Civic drops by 1.4 inches versus the Civic sedan. However, this is still about 3 inches more than you'll find in a Ford Focus. The Ford Focus's back seats are fairly tight, and in this vehicle I still have about 3 or 4 inches of legroom sitting right here behind myself. This is about the same kind of overall legroom and headroom that we find in the Mazda 3, but definitely more generous than the Volkswagen Golf, the Volkswagen Wagon, or that Ford Focus. If I scoot all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, the size difference versus the sedan is a little noticeable because I don't have quite as much legroom with this front seat all the way back in its tracks. However, as I said before, headroom is still very generous, so I would actually rather sit back here than in the Civic sedan on a long car trip. As you'd expect, the rear seats fold in a 60/40 fashion, and in an interesting twist, the center seat belt actually comes out of the seat back itself, not out of the ceiling, which is something that we more commonly see in Honda vehicles. Obviously, cargo capacity is the big reason you might want to buy a hatchback over the average sedan. However, when I first saw the Civic hatchback, I was a little bit concerned because we have this very swoopy profile and this very steeply raked rear glass. That obviously has an impact on cargo practicality, and if Honda were to make a Honda Civic wagon, you could fit more bags back here. But as it is, we still see a 66% improvement in cargo capacity versus the Civic sedan, 25.7 cubic feet. That allowed this vehicle to score 4 in our 24-inch roller bag test. I could very easily put these 4 bags right back here, but most importantly, you cannot actually stand them up and still close the hatch. This is about the same kind of cargo room that we see in the brand new 2018 Hyundai Elantra GT. It's actually 3 more than we find in the Volkswagen Golf and 2 more than in the Ford Focus. And that's because of the overall extra length that we find in the Civic hatchback. That helps compensate for the fact that this cargo area is just not as square as something like a Volkswagen Golf. Of course, if you want even more cargo room, you could buy the Volkswagen Golf wagon, then you'd get 5 cubic feet more room. Also worth noting is that under the cargo area load floor, we do find an available spare tire. When it comes to our exclusive trunk comfort index, I'm going to give this 8 out of 10 points. Obviously, the cargo area loses a few practicality points for having this very steeply raked glass, but does make up for them by having overall a very large and accommodating cargo area. Taking a quick spin around the interior, we have height adjustable seat belts for both the driver and the front passenger, and overall the interior is very similar to the other trims of the Civic. The sport trim that we're driving has fabric seats with contrasting stitching, and we also have these center sections in the seat bottom and seat back cushion that remind me a little bit of carbon fiber, that pattern that we have right there. The front door panels are a combination of hard and soft touch plastics. We have a soft armrest right there, a large bottle holder right here in front of the speaker grille. The middle section of the door has more of that carbon fiber-esque treatment going on. Then of course we have metallic trim on the door, and that moves on over to the dashboard. The rest of the interior is styled basically the same as the sedan and the coupe. We have a soft touch injection molded upper portion of the dashboard. The pattern is stamped in this metallic plastic, and then we have another soft touch injection molded section with faux stitching, and then we have a large bin style glove compartment right below that. In the center of the dashboard, we have 2 very large air vents, and then our model has the base audio system. The base audio system does not support Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, but it does have a Bluetooth and USB audio interface. Below that, we have a single zone automatic climate control system. And then we have a storage cubby where you can see I have my iPhone 7 Plus sitting right there. The USB input for this system is actually behind this area because this is a 2-tiered center console. You'll see that the USB cable actually comes out from over here on the left and then up through a hole there, and then you can put your phone in that storage area, or you can actually put things in the storage area just below that. Our vehicle does have the 6-speed manual transmission, which is the standard transmission in the LX and the Sport trims of the Civic hatchback. A very nice feature that we're starting to see in more and more Honda models is auto brake hold. This applies the pressure to the brakes and keeps the brake lights on when you're at a stop sign or at a stoplight or in stop-and-go traffic and you don't want to have your foot on the pedals. We simply enable the system by pressing this brake hold button right here, and then once brake pressure has been applied and the vehicle has come to a complete stop, you can put the transmission in neutral and you can even take your foot off of the clutch pedal and it will hold that brake pressure on. This feature definitely makes it easier to drive this vehicle in heavy city traffic. Behind that we have our electric parking brake button and then our Econ button. Between the front seats we have this very interesting center console, basically the same that we see in the Civic sedan. We have a fabric covered center armrest. This is soft touch, as are these outer sections right here. The armrest slides forwards and backwards and it also lifts up and out of the way. With that up and out of the way, we have access to the cup holders, which slide forwards and backwards. You can actually access them with this armrest still in place. The cup holder module also comes completely out of the vehicle, and you'll notice that we have another cup holder indent right there in the front section. That's for some very large drinks or some of those large insulated tumblers. And then we have a large storage well. I have a wallet right down there at the bottom to show you the size. The instrument cluster in this Sport trim is very similar to the other Civics we've showed on our channel, except that we don't have an LCD instrument cluster in the middle. This is actually an analog tachometer, and the only LCD is this small round one right here where we see the digital speedometer. In addition to the speedometer readout, we also get the outdoor temperature, our instant fuel economy, trip computer information, and of course the odometer and oil life. The steering wheel is basically the same 3-spoke wheel that we see in the other Civic models. We have sport grips right up top. You'll find the audio controls on the left side of the wheel and the cruise control on the right. Because this vehicle does not have the larger touchscreen infotainment system, we don't have the volume slider over here on the left side of the wheel. If we did have that option, then we would get that. The first thing you'll notice about the Civic, which is a little unusual for a vehicle with a Sport logo on the trunk lid, is that this is a very easy to live with vehicle. The suspension is not rock hard. This doesn't feel as hardcore as a GTI. That's of course because this is only the first semi-step up into performance for the Civic line, because we have a little bit more oomph under the hood, 180 horsepower in this particular version, but this isn't an SI and it's not an R. That allowed Honda to make the Civic Sport a little bit more relaxed and definitely more daily driver suitable. In terms of acceleration performance, we ran from 0 to 60 in this model in about 6.5 to 6.6 seconds, depending on how well I was shifting. That is a little bit slower than Honda says is the maximum speed with the manual transmission, likely because I'm not a professional driver. For those that are counting, that's about the same 0 to 60 time that we got in the Civic Coupe or the Civic Sedan with the CVT and the same turbocharged engine under the hood. Now, if you were to get the Civic hatchback with the CVT, for instance in the Sport trim or in the Sport Touring trim, then you go from 0 to 60 just a little bit faster than the model that we're driving right here. A dealer provided model ran from 0 to 60 in 6.4. If you take a look at that 0 to 60 chart at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice this is definitely not as fast as the Volkswagen GTI or something like a Ford Focus ST. But again, this is not that kind of vehicle. The other thing you'll notice, however, is that this is significantly faster than a Mazda 3 hatchback. Thanks to the wide tires that we have on this model, our 60 to 0 braking score is significantly lower than the other versions of the Civic we tested. We went from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 112 feet, which is very short for this segment. When it comes to acceleration and braking, this is very, very close to the last generation Civic Si. That's exactly why the Civic Si has taken just a little bit of time off in order for Honda to take that vehicle to the next level. The big difference between this and the previous generation Si is the way this vehicle handles. Now, we do have those wide 235 with tires, and handling is absolutely incredible for a compact vehicle like this. This handles better than a Mazda 3. I would actually say this is very similar to the Ford Focus ST. Handling feel, on the other hand, does come in a notch below the previous generation Si and a notch below the Mazda 3 hatchback. The Mazda 3 hatchback has an excellent feel to its suspension. We get a little bit more road feel than we see in the Honda Civic, and the steering feels just a hair more precise. Now that said, the overall feel of the suspension is definitely very sorted. This is closer to the Volkswagen GTI than the Elantra GT. Even in the Sport trim that we're driving with the 235/40 R18 tires, which are fairly low aspect ratio tires, it's obvious that the Civic hatch was really designed for daily driving and daily commuting, because this suspension is surprisingly compliant for a vehicle with a Sport logo on the back. This actually surprised me because my first impression of the suspension was, oh, it feels a lot softer than I had expected. And then I got out of the vehicle and I thought, oh, those tires are an awful lot lower profile than I had expected based on how the Civic was riding. This is possible because the Civic hatchback is very light, and just like we see in the Mazda MX-5 Miata, reducing the curb weight allows them to put a softer suspension in the vehicle without giving up that much when it comes to handling. Now, when you start really pushing this harder out on winding mountain roads, we do get a little bit more body roll than we find in some of the other more performance-oriented vehicles. Obviously, more body roll than we'll see in the Civic Si or the Civic R. And personally, I think that was exactly the right thing to do for this model because it makes it much easier to live with. When it comes to cabin noise, I'm going to give this model a B. We did score 73 decibels, which makes this a little bit louder than the Civic sedan and than the Civic hatch. That's very logical because, of course, we have that open hatch area right back there. Most hatchbacks tend to be louder versus their sedan or coupe counterparts, but this is actually fairly quiet as far as hatchbacks go. When it comes to fuel economy, we've been averaging just over 30 miles per gallon overall in the Civic hatch because we have been driving this pretty hard. As with most turbocharged cars, there's a pretty big difference in fuel economy whether you're driving the car gently or driving the car hard. That's quite logical because the whole point of a turbocharger is so that the vehicle can put more air and therefore more fuel into the cylinder. So if you're really driving this hatchback hard, it's going to be consuming just as much fuel as the average engine out there that produces 180 horsepower. On the other hand, if you're treating this vehicle gently out on the road, it's pretty easy to get mid to high 30s. When it comes to our overall fuel economy score, I'm going to give the CVT equipped hatch an A and the manual equipped hatch a B-. You will definitely notice a decent difference in fuel economy between the two, especially if you're doing long distance driving. My on-the-road bottom line is that this reminds me a great deal of previous generation Volkswagen GTIs, before the Volkswagen GTI got just a little bit too German. Volkswagen's engineers are really trying to get the maximum amount of performance out of the Golf, and in that process, it seems that they've forgotten a little bit of what the Volkswagen GTI used to be about. It's no longer as affordable as it used to be. It's no longer as easy to live with as a daily driver as it used to be. The Honda engineers, on the other hand, have chosen a more balanced approach. They've created a vehicle that's very easy to live with and an incredible amount of fun when the road starts to bend. Perhaps what struck me most about the Honda Civic hatchback is how aggressively Honda has priced it. Because in the past, Honda has been one of the more premium priced entries in the segment, not being quite as low in terms of starting price as some of the competition. But the hatchback starts at $19,700 for 2017, and the sport trim that we have been driving was $21,300, and there aren't really any options available. It's exactly as we've been seeing it. The top-end Sport Touring trim is just under $29,000, which is also very well priced for this segment. A fully loaded Mazda 3 will cost you several $1,000s more. If you're looking at the Sport or Sport Touring trim, there are a few things that you should know. If you want the manual transmission, it's only available in the Sport. However, if you want some of the luxury features like the LED headlamps, the up-level audio system, and the Honda sensing system, which includes radar adaptive cruise control, you have to get the continuously variable transmission and the Sport Touring trim. That's perhaps my only complaint about the Sport trim itself, is that there is no Sport trim version of perhaps the EX or EXL trim. So you can't get Apple CarPlay or Android Auto or leather upholstery in that Sport trim. You also have to make do with the lower end speaker system. The 8-speaker audio system doesn't happen until the EX trim. That really shows up when we start taking a look at pros and cons, because although the Civic is very well priced, you do have to live with the features that come in those dedicated trim levels. Fuel economy obviously drops if you select the Sport trim over the other base trims of the hatchback because we get those wider tires and of course we have the manual transmission. The best fuel economy will be found in those with the CVT. Although wide tires obviously have a negative impact on fuel economy, the top-end Sport Touring trim with its wide 235 width tires is actually still one of the more fuel-efficient hatchbacks available. Now to the cons. You'll notice that the back seat shrinks in the Civic hatchback versus the Civic sedan. That means that we have a little bit less legroom than in the other forms of the Civic. Again, options are limited if you want the manual transmission. You'll notice that I have lower performance versus the GTI on the con side. Now, keeping that in perspective, this is not a direct Volkswagen GTI competitor. It is considerably less expensive. It's also less powerful. The reason for that is that the Civic Sport Hatchback and the Sport Touring are not the end of the line for Civic performance. They're merely the first station, because we will be seeing a Civic Si as well as the Civic Type R. Let's dive into the Volkswagen GTI first. As I said, it is significantly more expensive than the Civic Sport. Of course, the Volkswagen is significantly faster than the Honda, but the price difference is fairly significant. There's obviously a pretty big difference when it comes to styling philosophy between the Civic and the GTI. The GTI is much more restrained, much more elegant in its particular styling. The Civic hatchback, especially in the Sport trim, is very look at me. That could be either a pro or a con depending on your particular feelings. As I said during the drive section, the Honda Civic Sport reminds me a great deal of previous generation Volkswagen GTIs, because the GTIs have become expensive, they've become heavier over time, they obviously handle excellently, and they accelerate very quickly, but they've lost a little bit of what the GTI was all about originally, and I think we find that in the Civic Sport. Although the price difference between the GTI and the Civic Sport starts at around $4,000, it becomes quite large because the GTI gets very, very expensive. Now obviously you can find options in the GTI that you can't get in the Civic hatchback, like an active suspension. But again, that's another area where I think the Civic Sport recalls the original feelings that I had when I first drove a GTI perhaps 15-20 years ago. Next up we have the Ford Focus hatchback, which starts just under $20,000. Keep in mind we don't get a turbocharged engine in the base Ford Focus. That means that the Ford is actually going to be more expensive when comparably equipped versus the Civic. There's no exact corollary to the sport trim of the Civic that we've been driving this week. You can of course get the Ford Focus ST for just under $25,000, but that's not a direct competitor to the Honda Civic Sport. Interestingly enough, the Focus ST is not really going to be a direct competitor to the Civic Type R either, because the Civic Type R is that next step beyond the Ford Focus ST. Now depending on the trim level of the Ford Focus that you're looking at, it is likely going to sell below the MSRP to a degree larger than we see over in the Civic hatchback. The Civic is likely going to be selling pretty close to the MSRP. The Ford, it's pretty easy to get $1,000 or $2,000 off if you shop around. Although that does help level the playing field, again, the Ford Focus does not come with the same level of standard equipment and does not come with that turbocharged engine standard like we find in the Honda Civic hatchback, so even accounting for that lower actual transaction price in the Focus, it's still going to be about the same price or a little bit more expensive than the Civic. And that price delta actually increases as we claw our way on up the trim ladder. Top-end fully loaded versions of the Ford Focus hatchback will be more expensive than the Sport Touring trim of the Civic. That's also what we see with the Mazda 3 hatchback. It starts fairly reasonably at $19,905, but if you add all of the options to your Mazda 3, you'll end up over $31,000. And that's about $3,000 more expensive than a comparably equipped Honda Civic hatchback. Regardless of how you configure your Mazda 3, however, it's going to be slower than the comparable Honda. The reason for that is that the base trims of the Mazda 3 get a 155 horsepower 4-cylinder engine. The top-end trims do get a more powerful 2.5-liter 4-cylinder, but it's still not as quick as the 1.5-liter turbo that we see in the sport trims of the Civic hatchback. There are two likely reasons for that. The first one, of course, is that the Honda Civic has a turbocharged engine that really broadens the horsepower curve, broadens the torque curve. We also have a continuously variable transmission that helps the engine keep the boost on so it doesn't have to drop the boost while it's changing gears, and that really does improve 0 to 60 performance. It's not quite as engaging as a traditional automatic transmission, but it definitely is going to get you 0 to 60 faster than what we see over in the Mazda 3. The last reason is that I suspect Honda is underrating the 4-cylinder turbocharged engine in the sport trims of the Civic. I expect, based on the 0 to 60 times that we were seeing out of that engine, that we're really getting more like 190, perhaps 195 horsepower out of it. Mazda offers a wide variety of features and options in the Mazda 3. There's a little bit more room to customize your Mazda versus the Honda Civic. However, in terms of overall actual feature content, the Honda Civic is really right there at the top. Although the Mazda 3 is getting a little bit old these days, they have refreshed it recently, and I think the overall exterior design is still one of the best looking in this segment. Last up, we have the all-new Hyundai Elantra GT. This really looks like an interesting option. It's all new for the 2018 model year, inside and out. We get a more restrained, more Volkswagen-like exterior styling and interior styling that reminds me a little bit of the Mazda 3. But I think the interior quality is actually better in the Hyundai than we find in the Mazda. I think the interior quality overall is very comparable Hyundai to Honda. Some people may dislike the way the touchscreen infotainment system is mounted in the dashboard of the new Elantra GT, but I actually kind of like it. It helps keep your eyes a little bit closer to the road, and overall that's likely going to make things a little bit safer. Now keep in mind that we have not driven the new Elantra GT yet because it has not actually launched yet. However, the Elantra GT will offer the same engines that we see in the Elantra for the most part. We will get the optional 1.6-liter turbocharged engine, which goes from 0 to 60 just about as fast as the Civic Sport. The Elantra GT with that 1.6-liter turbocharged engine will also feature Hyundai's 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, which really does seem more engaging than the CVT that we find in the Honda. It's not necessarily going to get you from 0 to 60 faster, it's not really going to save you any more fuel, than the CVT that we find in the Honda, but it is going to feel a little bit more traditional. Keeping in mind that I think the Volkswagen GT is in a slightly different segment than the Civic and the Civic Sport, my top pick in this segment is the Civic Sport Hatchback. The Civic Hatchback, especially in the top-end touring trim, is very, very easy to live with. We have a suspension that's not absolutely rock hard, although it doesn't really give up that much in terms of overall handling ability. We have that very large cargo area in the back, which is very practical. Comfortable seats with Honda's latest seat design. The Sport Touring trim also offers a lot of luxury features at a lower price than the typical value brands in this segment. The radar adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, LED headlamps, etc. Now that said, I would definitely keep an eye on the Hyundai Elantra GT, especially in that upcoming trim with their 1.6-liter turbocharged engine and the dual-clutch automatic transmission. I think that's going to be a very fierce battle. Personally, I prefer the styling inside and out on the Elantra GT, but we don't know what it's going to be like to drive yet. Based on our experiences with the Elantra Sport, however, you should expect the Elantra GT to be a little bit less efficient than the Honda Civic Hatchback, handle almost as well, but have a overall handling feel that's just a little bit below the Honda. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2017 Honda Civic Sport Hatchback. Be sure and check out those related videos that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Head on over to facebook.com/AlexonAutos, and if you want to support this channel, you can always find us over at patreon.com. I'll see you next week.